All right, let's go. Number 10. The Forger Who Fooled Scholars, but Not the Machine. In February 2019, in a climate-controlled conservation lab in Washington, D.C., art fraud investigator Colette Lall pulled the first of 16 fragments from its housing and slid it under a three-dimensional digital microscope. The Museum of the Bible had paid her 9 months in advance to answer one question: were its Dead Sea Scroll fragments real? Lall adjusted the focus and watched ink resolve into a hairline crack that ran straight through a letter. Ink does not sit inside a crack that formed after the ink dried. It sits on top of it, or it does not reach it at all. The museum's 16 fragments had been purchased after 2002, decades after the original Qumran cache was cataloged, from a shifting roster of private dealers. When they went on display in 2017, several scholars had already voiced doubts. The Museum of the Bible commissioned Lall's firm, Art Fraud Insights, to settle the question with instruments instead of opinions. Her 6-person advisory team ran multispectral and reflectance transformation imaging across every fragment, then subjected a sample set to Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, macro X-ray fluorescence mapping, and scanning electron microscopy with energy dispersive X-ray analysis, a battery of computational imaging tools that digitally reconstruct a surface at a resolution no human eye can. Achieve unassisted. The elemental maps told a story the naked eye had missed for years. At least 15 of the 16 fragments were written not on the tanned thin parchment used at Qumran, but on old leather, in several cases, leather likely cut from ancient sandals or shoes, chemically aged to pass as 2,000-year-old scroll material. The imaging software mapped ink pooling into surface cracks and flowing over decayed edges, which meant the ink had been applied centuries after the leather had already begun to deteriorate. A forger in the 20th century had sourced genuine ancient leather, aged it further, and inked it to mimic a Qumran hand convincing enough to pass 3 separate teams of paleographers. But here's where the case stops being about one museum's bad luck. In 2016, before Lall's investigation, a group of leading Dead Sea Scrolls scholars had published a book analyzing 13 of these same fragments and pronounced most of them credible. Trained eyes, decades of paleographic experience, and direct physical access to the objects were not enough. The forgery held up under expert visual inspection. It did not hold up under a machine that mapped chemistry and geometry at a scale invisible to human perception. Lall's final report ran 200 pages. It concluded, without qualification, that all 16 fragments were modern forgeries built with the specific intent to mimic authentic Dead Sea Scroll material. The museum removed the fragments from display and published the findings in full, an unusual act of institutional transparency that other collections holding suspect post-2002 fragments have yet to match. The deception had not been sudden. As early as 2018, a separate team had tested 5 of the 16 fragments and already concluded they were fake. But the museum's full collection remained on public display for 2 more years while the larger investigation ran its course. And the fragments had passed more than casual inspection before that. In 2016, a group of respected Dead Sea Scroll scholars published a full academic volume analyzing 13 of the same pieces, drawing on paleographic comparison and direct physical handling, and judged most of them credible enough to publish. Lall's forensic imaging did not just catch a forger. It caught a peer-reviewed scholarly consensus. The museum's own chief curatorial officer, Jeffrey Kloha, later called the unraveling an interesting kind of detective story, one that took 9 months, 5 outside conservators, and instruments no forger working decades earlier could have anticipated being pointed at their work. The fragments had been sourced through a post-2002 antiquities market the museum's founding family had trusted, without requiring the kind of documented excavation history serious institutions demand. "We're victims," a museum representative said when the report went public. "We're victims of misrepresentation. We're victims of fraud." The 16 forged fragments now sit in storage at the Museum of the Bible, cataloged not as biblical artifacts, but as evidence of the fraud that produced them. Before we get to number 9, if you want the physical, on the ground case for biblical accuracy laid out in one place, the excavations, the inscriptions. The artifacts that keep aligning with the text, there's a 60-page ebook covering exactly that. Links in the description. Number 9. The machine that redates the ancient world. On a March morning in 2022 at the Epigraphic Museum in Athens, a research team fed a photograph into a laptop. The image showed IG I-3-4b, a decree concerning the Acropolis dated by generations of epigraphers to 485 or 484 BCE. Within seconds, a neural network returned its own estimate and flagged the traditional date as statistically improbable. The tool was Ithaca, built by a team from DeepMind, Oxford, Ca' Foscari University of Venice, and the Athens University of Economics and Business, and published in Nature in March 2022. Ithaca is a transformer-based deep neural network trained on the largest digital archive of Greek inscriptions in existence, the Packard Humanities Institute corpus, spanning the 7th century BC to the 5th century C. Its task is threefold: restore missing characters and damaged stone, attribute the inscription's likely place of origin, and estimate the date it was carved. Working alone, Ithaca restores damaged text with 62% accuracy. It attributes geographic origin correctly 71% of the time. It dates inscriptions to within 30 years of their true range. The more striking number came from the humans. Historians working without the model restored damaged texts with 25% accuracy. Paired with Ithaca, that number rose to 72%, higher than the machine's solo performance and higher than either human or machine achieved alone. Jonathan Progg, professor of ancient history at Oxford and a co-author on the paper, had spent a career trained to read damaged stone by instinct and comparison. Ithaca did not replace that instinct. It gave it something to argue with. Sommerskjöld and Asael have pointed out that the inscriptions at stake are not decorative curiosities. Everything from religious calendars to civic laws and property leases survives only on stone like this, meaning the model's restorations carry direct evidentiary weight for reconstructing how entire ancient institutions genuinely functioned. Ithaca builds on an earlier system called Pythia, which DeepMind and Oxford had developed years before to handle text restoration alone. When classicists first heard a technology company was building software to fill in gaps in sacred and civic inscriptions, the reaction inside the field was not universal enthusiasm. Epigraphy is a discipline built on decades of hard-won manuscript intuition. And some scholars worried a black box model would simply hand down predictions no one could verify. DeepMind and its academic partners answered that skepticism the only way that mattered, by publishing accuracy figures against a held-out test set no model had seen during training, and by releasing Ithaca as a free public tool through Google Arts and Culture so any historian, museum curator, or student could test its predictions against their own expertise rather than take the numbers on faith. Sommerskjöld and her co-author Yannis Asael have said the tool is designed to restore up to half of a damaged inscription, drawing confidently on gaps as large as 10 consecutive missing characters, the kind of loss that once simply ended a scholarly argument rather than resolving it. The DeepMind team has since confirmed publicly that the same architecture is being adapted to other ancient writing systems, Akkadian cuneiform, Egyptian Demotic, and ancient Hebrew among them. That detail matters more than it first appears. The entire discipline of biblical epigraphy rests on inscriptions too fragmentary, too displaced, or too disputed to date with confidence by eye alone. Ostraka, whose find spot is uncertain, Seals, whose script style splits scholarly opinion by a century or more. A tool that can push human dating accuracy from 1 in 4 correct to nearly 3 in 4, applied to a script family that underlies the entire textual history of the Hebrew Bible, does not just refine individual readings. It puts a mathematical floor under a discipline that has spent 2 centuries arguing largely from trained intuition. What makes Ithaca particularly unsettling is not that it restores broken letters. It's that it exposes how much of ancient chronology was never really fixed, only agreed upon, by scholars trained to see the same patterns the same way, for long enough that the agreement calcified into fact. The Ig I3 4b decree still hangs in the Epigraphic Museum in Athens, its carved gaps unchanged since the 5th century BC. The date beneath it in the museum catalog has not yet been revised. The model that could revise it is still running. Number 8. The algorithm that found a hymn no one had read in 3,000 years. In a storeroom in Baghdad, a clay fragment no larger than a postcard had sat uncatalogued for decades, one of tens of thousands recovered from the ruins of Sippar, an ancient city 18 miles southeast of the site legend holds Noah's tablets were buried in before the flood. In 2018, archaeologist Anmar Fadl of the University of Baghdad photographed it for digitization. Individually, it was unreadable, a handful of cuneiform wedges broken off midline, no clear beginning, no clear end. The Sippar library itself carries a weight beyond ordinary archaeology. According to the Babylonian priest Berossus, writing centuries after the fact, it was in Sippar that the legendary flood hero buried the antediluvian tablets of civilization before the waters rose. A Mesopotamian flood tradition scholars have long read alongside the Genesis flood narrative as evidence of a shared ancient Near Eastern memory of catastrophic inundation. Since 2018, the University of Baghdad and Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich have run a joint mission to decipher and preserve the hundreds of cuneiform tablets recovered from that library, most of them broken into pieces scattered across decades of excavation lots. Enrique Jimenez, professor of Assyriology at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, had spent years building something to solve exactly this problem. His electronic Babylonian library platform digitizes cuneiform fragments scattered across museum collections on every continent, then runs them through pattern-matching software trained to spot textual overlaps invisible to a human reader working from memory or catalog cards. In 2023, the platform flagged Fadl's fragment against a cluster of other pieces. The algorithm proposed they belonged to the same composition. Jimenez had never seen the hymn before. Neither had anyone else alive. Over the following 2 years, the AI-supported matching system identified 30 separate manuscripts belonging to the same text, a process Jimenez has said would have taken decades of manual cross-referencing by a human scholar working alone. Stitched together, the fragments yielded roughly 250 lines, about 2/3 of a hymn, in praise of Marduk in the city of Babylon. Copied by scribes across 4 centuries, from the 7th century BC down to the 2nd, after Alexander's conquests had already reshaped the region. The hymn describes Babylon as a garden of fruit, its women serving as priestesses and ritual intermediaries in roles Mesopotamian literature rarely records in this kind of domestic human detail. Jimenez has called it the first time such explicit information about the daily religious lives of Babylonian women has surfaced in the textual record. The hymn was copied by children at school, he has said. It's unusual that such a popular text in its day was unknown to us before now, a text so widely reproduced across 4 centuries of Babylonian classrooms that it should, by rights, have been one of the best-known compositions to survive from the ancient Near East, if any one scholar had ever been able to see all 30 pieces of it at once. The completed portions describe the city in language closer to devotional poetry than administrative record. Babylon flourishes in her charms like a fruit garden, the hymn declares, while the Euphrates nourishes fields and souls alike. And Marduk himself appears as the architect of the universe, protector of the weak and the vulnerable. Roughly 100 lines from the composition's final column remain permanently lost, broken away before any scribe copied that section onto a surviving tablet. A reminder that even a reconstruction this complete is still built on absence as much as recovery. The manuscripts span exactly the period during which the kingdom of Judah lived under Babylonian shadow and then Babylonian conquest. The same city, the same empire, the same centuries the Second Book of Kings describes, bringing Jerusalem's walls down and its people into exile. A hymn schoolchildren copied by rote in the classrooms of the city that destroyed Solomon's temple had been sitting in fragments across multiple institutional collections for over a century, unrecognized, because no single scholar could hold 30 scattered pieces from 30 different excavation lots in their head at once. Consider the implication. The algorithm did not translate anything. It did not interpret a single line. It simply noticed, at a scale and speed no human philologist can match, that separate pieces of broken clay were parts of the same whole, a form of pattern recognition that has been sitting latent in museum basements since the pieces were first excavated, waiting only for something capable of comparing all of them at once. Roughly a third of the hymn is gone for good, its final column broken away before any scribe's copy of that section survived to be excavated at all. No amount of pattern-matching software can compare fragments that were never recovered in the first place, somewhere in the debris of a 4,000-year-old city, or in a museum drawer not yet digitized. The missing 100 lines may or may not still exist. Nothing currently running is looking for them, because nothing yet knows they are there to find. Number 7. The mathematics that split Paul in two. In 1851, the English logician Augustus de Morgan wrote a letter to a colleague proposing something radical for its time, that the authorship of the Pauline epistles could be tested by counting words. He never ran the analysis himself. It would take machines to finish what he started. By 2019, computational linguist Jacques Savoy had the processing power de Morgan lacked. Savoy applied two statistical measures, Burroughs' delta and Labb's intertextual distance, tools originally built for disputed Shakespearean and French literary authorship, to all 13 epistles attributed to Paul in the New Testament. The method strips away subject matter entirely and measures something subtler, the frequency of function words, the small connective tissue of language a writer uses without conscious thought, and but, which therefore these words are nearly impossible to consciously imitate because writers rarely notice using them at all. Savoy's clustering analysis returned 4 distinct stylistic groups. His conclusion, published in the Journal of the Association for Information Science and Technology, stated plainly that Ephesians, Colossians, Titus, and both epistles to Timothy did not statistically belong with the rest of the corpus. The method itself had already proven its power outside biblical studies. In 1963, statisticians Frederick Mosteller and David Wallace used the same kind of function word analysis to settle a 2-century-old dispute over 12 of the anonymously published Federalist Papers, definitively assigning them to James Madison over Alexander Hamilton, using nothing but word frequency mathematics. If the technique could resolve a founding-era authorship dispute with that kind of confidence, applying it to the New Testament's most contested letters was, to Savoy and the researchers who followed him, simply a matter of pointing a proven tool at a much older argument. This was not new territory theologically. Scholars had disputed the authorship of the pastoral epistles, Titus and the 2 letters to Timothy, since the 19th century, largely on vocabulary and doctrinal grounds. What computational stylometry offered was something closer to a fingerprint than an opinion, a mathematical distance between texts that did not care about theology, chronology, or tradition, only about how consistently a hand used the word which. A 2025 study published in the journal Hypel Novum went further still, applying deep learning authorship verification models, architecture closer to the neural networks used in modern language technology than to Savoy's classical statistical clustering, directly against the disputed letters. The deep learning approach did not simply confirm the older statistical split. It surfaced connections no theologian had ever proposed, and no classical stylometric method had flagged, at one point finding 2 Timothy statistically closer to 2 Peter than either resembled several undisputed Pauline letters, a pairing with no basis anywhere in 2,000 years of church tradition, which treats the two as written by entirely different authors in different circumstances. But here's where the case gets complicated rather than clean. In 2025, a peer-reviewed study in the journal Religions systematically reran the Pauline corpus through more than half a dozen computational methods published since Savoy's paper, including newer deep learning verification models. The results did not converge. One method paired 2 Timothy stylistically with 2 Peter, two texts no scholar of any tradition considers connected. Another found 1 John statistically closer to 1 Corinthians than some of Corinthians' own internal samples were to each other. To test whether the disagreement was a flaw in the underlying texts or a flaw in the mathematics, the same researchers ran a control. They applied their natural language processing pipeline to a known secure body of writing entirely outside the biblical corpus, surviving letters of the 4th century Roman Emperor Julian, a single verified author writing in a fixed historical window. The control produced the same instability. Results that should have converged on one confident author instead came back malleable and inconsistent depending on which statistical model was asked. That result reframed the entire question. If the mathematics could not even hold steady on a writer whose identity was never in doubt, the disagreement running through the Pauline results could not be blamed on Paul or on his scribes, or on the theological stakes of the argument. It pointed instead at a hard limit built into the method itself. The researchers concluded that without an independently verified reference sample of Paul's own writing, which does not exist, because every surviving copy passed through generations of scribal transmission, no mathematical model can fully solve the authorship question. The tools produce numbers. The numbers do not agree with each other, even when the author is not in question at all. What the data leaves unexplained is not whether Paul wrote every word attributed to him. It is why the undisputed epistles, Romans, the Corinthian letters, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, Philemon, cluster together with unusual consistency across nearly every method tested, while the disputed letters scatter unpredictably depending on which algorithm is asked. A single author leaves one kind of fingerprint. A single style, imitated by different hands at different times, leaves several. The machines cannot say which explanation is correct. They can only confirm that 6 of Paul's letters speak with one voice, and the rest do not speak with any voice consistently at all. Number 6. The eyes in orbit that found the holes in the ground. In the winter after the 2011 Egyptian Revolution, a satellite 200 miles above the Nile Delta captured an image of a field outside the ancient site of Lisht that had been undisturbed a year earlier. By the time Egyptologist Sarah Parcak pulled the image onto her monitor in Birmingham, Alabama, the field was pockmarked with dark craters, hundreds of them. Fresh looting pits dug in the weeks after national security collapsed and armed guards abandoned rural excavation sites across the country, leaving thousands of years of buried stratigraphy exposed to anyone with a shovel and a willingness to work at night. Parcak had spent the previous decade using declassified satellite imagery and multispectral analysis to locate buried settlements the naked eye could never see from the ground, subtle differences in soil chemistry and vegetation stress that mark the outline of a wall or a foundation still buried under centuries of Nile silt, invisible on the ground even to someone standing directly on top of it. That work had already located more than 3,000 previously unknown ancient settlements, over a dozen unexcavated pyramids, and more than 1,000 undocumented tombs, including the buried city grid of Tanis. After 2011, she turned the same technique toward destruction instead of discovery, working with her team and with a specialist in automated image classification. She co-authored a 2016 paper in the journal Antiquity documenting the results. Of 1,100 archaeological sitescapes examined across the Nile Valley and Delta between 2002 and 2013, looting was confirmed at 279, totaling more than 200,000 individual pits. The scale of that number mattered as much as the discovery itself. Manually reviewing over a decade of high-resolution satellite coverage across more than 1,000 individual sites, frame by frame, would have consumed years of a research team's working life. It was not a task suited to human labor at all. It was a task suited to a machine that never gets tired of looking at dirt. In 2016, after winning the TED Prize, Parcak used the funding to launch Global Explorer, a citizen science platform that trained ordinary volunteers online to spot looting pits and unrecorded structures across tens of thousands of satellite tiles, crowdsourcing the first pass of a job too large for any single research team, before algorithmic classification took over the task of screening imagery at true scale. The platform deliberately obscured each tile's exact coordinates before showing it to volunteers, a safeguard designed to keep the crowdsourcing process itself from accidentally handing looters a map to sites archaeologists had not yet secured. Reviewing that volume of imagery by human eye alone was not sustainable at scale, so Parcak's team went further. In a follow-up study published in Frontiers in ICT, she worked with computer scientists to build and test an automated image processing algorithm capable of identifying looting damage in very high-resolution satellite photographs without a human analyst manually scanning every frame, flagging disturbed earth, geometric pit patterns, and freshly excavated backfill with accuracy that matched or exceeded manual review at a fraction of the time cost. The Nile Delta and Valley are precisely the landscape the Book of Exodus places at the center of its narrative, the Delta region where, according to the text, a Hebrew population multiplied under Egyptian rule before their departure. Most of that region's archaeological record lies not in the desert, where sites are stable and well documented, but in the Delta's wet, silt-covered, densely populated floodplain, where sites erode, flood, and vanish beneath modern towns before any excavation permit is filed. What makes this particularly unsettling is not the number of pits the algorithm found. It's what the algorithm cannot find: the sites that were never flagged because they were looted, backfilled, and built over between one satellite pass and the next, erased completely before any image existed to notice the disturbance at all. What the algorithm exposed was not a single discovery, but a rate, an accelerating erasure of exactly the kind of settlement evidence that would let archaeologists test, refine, or challenge biblical-era claims about the Delta's population, movement, and Egyptian administrative presence, vanishing faster than any excavation team could survey it by hand. Unlike the stable desert sands protecting Upper Egypt's monuments, the Delta is a working, flooding, urbanizing floodplain where an undiscovered settlement can be plowed under, built over, or looted into rubble within a single growing season, long before any excavation permit clears the relevant ministry. Parcak has argued that without systematic, algorithm-assisted monitoring at continental scale, the region stands to lose the majority of its unexcavated archaeological record within the coming decades, not to war or to time, but simply to agriculture and expanding cities moving faster than archaeologists ever could. Some of the looted sites Parcak's team flagged have since been secured. Most have not. No Egyptian ministry has published a comprehensive response to the algorithm's findings. No international task force has been assembled to prioritize excavation at the sites the software flagged as most active. The pits are visible today from orbit, silent rectangles in farmland, and no field team has been sent to see what was taken out of the ground before the satellite noticed the hole. Quick one before we keep going: if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time, and drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every one of them. Number 5. The algorithm rebuilding a library scattered across 60 collections. In December 1896, Solomon Schechter climbed into the attic storeroom of the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Old Cairo and found himself standing in a room, piled waist deep with 1,000 years of discarded Hebrew manuscript. He had been tipped off by 2 Scottish twin sisters, biblical scholars in their own right, who had shown him a curious parchment fragment they had purchased in the Cairo antiquities market and could not identify. Schechter recognized it immediately as a portion of the Hebrew original of the Book of Ecclesiasticus, a text long assumed to survive only in Greek and other secondary translations. He boarded a boat to Cairo within weeks. Jewish law forbids destroying any text bearing the name of God, so for a millennium the community had simply placed worn-out scripture, legal contracts, medical prescriptions, and private letters into this Geniza, this storeroom, rather than throw them away. Schechter shipped roughly 220,000 fragments back to Cambridge. Another 100,000 scattered over the following century into some 60 libraries and private collections spanning 15 countries. The contents themselves span the entire texture of a medieval community's life: legal contracts, marriage agreements, medical prescriptions, business ledgers documenting trade routes stretching from India to Spain, private letters between merchants, and fragments of biblical commentary and halakhic rulings that never survived anywhere else. Scholars have used the Geniza for over a century to reconstruct everything from the price of bread in 11th century Fustat to lost recensions of biblical texts that predate the standardized medieval Hebrew Bible most modern readers assume was always fixed. For most of the 20th century, reuniting a single torn page with its other half, determining that a fragment in Cambridge and a fragment in a Philadelphia archive were once the same physical document, depended entirely on a scholar happening to recognize a familiar hand across two collections they had both, by chance, examined. Most joins were never found. In 2011, computer scientists Lear Wolf and Nachum Dershowitz at Tel Aviv University adapted facial recognition software, the same underlying technology used to match human faces across photographs, to instead compare the physical texture, ruling patterns, and letter forms of digitized Geniza fragments, flagging pairs statistically likely to originate from the same manuscript. It was the first computational tool built specifically to reunite the collection at scale. That tool was a proof of concept, built and tested on a benchmark dataset modeled directly on a facial recognition standard called labeled faces in the wild. Researchers had, in effect, taught a machine to treat a torn page the way it would treat a photographed human face. Searching for the same underlying document identity beneath two different scraps of parchment. In parallel, Princeton's Geniza Lab and the citizen science platform Zooniverse recruited thousands of untrained volunteers to sort digitized fragments by hand, generating labeled data that later computational models would need to learn from. Over the next decade, computational linguist Yakov Choeka, who joined the Friedberg Geniza project as its chief computerization scientist in 2005, and his library partners completed the digital imaging of the entire Cairo Geniza, treating every fragment as a potential source of irreproducible information, even fragments that contained no legible writing at all, which scholars had previously advised him not to bother processing. The real transformation came in 2023, when an international team secured a €10 million European Research Council Synergy grant, the first such grant ever awarded for Jewish studies, to fund a project called Midrash, applying handwritten text recognition and large-scale computational analysis to the entire digitized Geniza archive at once. The grant was the first of its kind ever awarded specifically for computational research in Jewish studies, funding an international team of historians, computer scientists, and linguists to apply handwritten text recognition models trained on thousands of manually transcribed sample pages, then set loose across the full digitized archive at a pace no human transcription effort could ever match. Before Midrash, despite 2 decades of digitization work by the Friedberg Geniza project, fewer than 10% of the roughly 400,000 fragments had a readable transcription attached to them. The overwhelming majority of 1,000 years of Jewish textual life sat photographed, searchable by image, but functionally unread. A library visible to cameras and invisible to search engines, its contents locked behind nothing more than the sheer volume of handwriting no team of human transcribers could ever finish reading in several careers combined. What makes this particularly unsettling is not the backlog itself, it's the ratio. 90% of a collection this size sitting untranscribed means 90% of it has never been indexed against any other text, never checked for quotations of lost halakhic rulings, never cross-referenced against biblical commentary fragments, never searched for a single name that might connect a business ledger to a rabbinic responsum 3 shelves away in a different country. Waiting in a different library, cataloged under a different call number no one had reason to compare against this one. The scholarly community has been working for over a century with roughly 1/10 of the evidence legible enough to search, an entire discipline of medieval Jewish history built, unavoidably, on a 10% sample of its own source material. Simply because reading the other 90% by hand across 60 scattered collections was never within the reach of a human lifetime. No comprehensive tally yet exists of what the newly transcribed 90% contains. The National Library of Israel and its Midrash partners have not published a summary of results. The fragments themselves are unchanged, the same brittle vellum and paper Schechter carried out of Cairo in wooden crates, the same ink flaking at the same folds it has flaked at for 1,000 years, but for the first time in 1,000 years, something is finally reading all of it at once. Number 4. The computer program that rewrote a line of Scripture. At the Institute for New Testament Textual Research in Münster, Germany, a database holds transcriptions of well over 100 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, painstakingly collated variant by variant across a century of scholarship, a project that traces its institutional roots back to Eberhard Nestle and Kurt Aland. The 20th century editors, whose names still appear on the spine of the standard Greek New Testament used in seminaries worldwide. In the early 2000s, textual critic Gerd Mink and his colleagues Klaus Wachtel and Volker Kerger built something to search that database differently than any human editor ever had, a program that maps every variant reading against every other, calculating which manuscripts most consistently agree with which, then using those coherence patterns to infer which reading came first and which came later as a copying error or deliberate change. They called it the coherence-based genealogical method. The method rests on a distinction most readers never encounter: the difference between a manuscript and the text a manuscript carries. A copy made in the 10th century can, in places, preserve a reading older than a copy made in the 4th century, if the 10th century scribe was working from a now-lost exemplar that branched off the tradition earlier. Minuscule 1739. A Greek manuscript copied roughly 600 years after the New Testament was written, has long been known to preserve reading scholars' date far earlier than its own physical age would suggest. The coherence-based genealogical method was built to detect exactly that kind of buried early testimony, hiding inside a physically late copy, by calculating coherence patterns no single scholar could track by hand across a tradition this large. Traditional textual criticism weighs a reading heavily if it appears in the oldest surviving manuscripts, the assumption being that older copies sit closer to the original, an assumption so deeply embedded in the discipline that entire generations of editors treated it as close to axiomatic rather than as one hypothesis among several. The coherence-based genealogical method does not assume that. It tests it, manuscript by manuscript, across the entire tradition at once, a calculation too large for any individual scholar to perform by hand across thousands of variant readings and hundreds of witnesses. The test case that mattered came at 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 16. Every one of the earliest surviving Greek manuscripts, including Papyrus 72 and the 4th century codices Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, reads that a Christian who suffers should not be ashamed, but should glorify God in this name, using the Greek word onomati. For over a century, editors of the standard critical Greek New Testament printed exactly that reading, because it was the oldest attested. The coherence-based genealogical method's calculation disagreed. Running the full manuscript tradition through its coherence analysis, the program determined that a different, rarer word, mere, meaning in this matter or in this respect, showed stronger genealogical coherence across the tradition as a whole, despite appearing only in later witnesses. Beginning with the 28th edition of the Nestle Aland Greek New Testament, the standard critical text used by translators and scholars worldwide, the editors changed the printed reading from onomati to mere, altering, for the first time in over a century of editions, the word Peter's letter uses to describe how a suffering Christian glorifies God. A believer no longer, in the critical text, suffers and glorifies God in this name. They suffer and glorify God in this matter instead. A substitution of a single word in a single verse that nonetheless reaches into how the passage has been preached, translated, and quoted in every language derived from that critical edition since. The reading with almost no early manuscript support overruled the reading found in every one of the oldest surviving witnesses, not because a scholar argued for it, but because a computer calculated that the manuscript tradition as a whole, weighed across every branch and every copying error, pointed there instead. What makes this particularly unsettling is not that the reading changed. It's that the change ran backward against every rule textual criticism claimed to follow, the oldest evidence lost to a calculation, in the one passage of the New Testament that tells a suffering Christian what to call the thing they are suffering for. Critics of the method, textual scholar Peter Gurry among them, have raised what specialists call the black box objection, a perception that the computer is making more editorial decisions than it truly is, and that the calculation's internal logic is harder for outside scholars to audit line by line than a traditional argument laid out in readable prose anyone can follow and challenge. The Institute's own defenders answer that the program does not replace scholarly judgment, only extends it, closer, they argue, to an accountant using a calculator than a machine making theology on its own. But the accountant's calculator does not overturn 100 years of settled printed text. In the Catholic epistles alone, the coherence method drove 34 separate changes to the standard critical edition, more revision in one methodological shift than the previous several editions combined had produced. What the change leaves unresolved is not whether the algorithm's math is sound. Peer review has confirmed the calculation, and the Institute has published its methodology openly enough that any sufficiently trained scholar can, in principle, rerun the coherence analysis and check the result independently. What it leaves unresolved is more unsettling. If 100 years of textual scholars, working directly from the oldest surviving physical evidence, printed the wrong word in one of Christianity's foundational identity texts, the very passage describing what it means to suffer as a Christian, until a coherence algorithm caught it, the question of how many other readings and how many other verses are still waiting on a calculation no one has run, yet remains entirely open. Number 3. The Pallas A computer rebuilt from tourist photographs. On February 26, 2015, militants entered the Mosul Museum in northern Iraq carrying sledgehammers and power drills, and filmed themselves toppling display cases and taking angle grinders to statues that had stood in Assyrian palaces for nearly 3,000 years before archaeologists ever excavated them. The propaganda video, released 3 days later, showed a fighter addressing the camera directly beside a headless winged bull, explaining that the destruction was a religious obligation. Museum staff who had fled the city in the chaos of the militant advance could only watch the footage afterward, from exile, and try to identify which specific pieces from their own collection were being destroyed on screen in real time. Among the pieces destroyed were monumental reliefs and a colossal lamassu from Nimrud, the 9th century BC capital of the Assyrian Empire, the same empire the second book of Kings describes conquering the northern kingdom of Israel and deporting its population in 722 BCE. An event that scattered 10 of Israel's 12 tribes into a historical disappearance later tradition would spend centuries trying to explain. Within the year, ISIS fighters used bulldozers on Nimrud's remaining palace ruins directly, and without hesitation, flattening excavation trenches that archaeologists had first opened in the 1840s and continued working, on and off, for nearly 170 years. 2 doctoral students, Chance Coffenor in Germany and Matthew Vincent in Spain, had already been experimenting with photogrammetry, a computational process that reconstructs 3-dimensional digital models from overlapping 2-dimensional photographs, the same underlying technique satellites use to map terrain. The concept had one working precedent after the Taliban destroyed the monumental Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan in 2001. A small team of researchers had attempted a similar reconstruction from existing photographs, proving the underlying computer vision could work at monument scale if someone built a system to collect the images fast enough, and if enough of those images existed anywhere in the world to be found. Even that precedent left an open question the Mosul case would have to answer for itself. Tourist photographs are not survey-grade documentation. They are taken at random angles, in inconsistent light, by people who never imagined their vacation snapshots would someday be the only surviving record of what they were standing in front of. Whether a reconstruction algorithm could extract measurement-accurate geometry from that kind of chaotic, uncalibrated image set, rather than a rough approximation useful only for illustration, remained genuinely uncertain until the software was tested directly against real losses at scale. Watching the Mosul destruction unfold on video, Coffinor and Vincent launched a platform within 2 weeks. First called Project Mosul, and later renamed RecRay. The concept was simple and desperate. Crowdsource every tourist photograph, every research image, every casual snapshot anyone had ever taken inside the Mosul Museum or at Nimrud itself, and feed them into reconstruction software capable of computing a 3-dimensional model from images that were never intended to document the object for preservation. UNESCO would later describe the demolition campaign across Mosul, Hatra, and Nimrud specifically as a war crime, noting that some of the destroyed material had never been fully cataloged or studied before it was lost. Sites were the only surviving evidence, after the sledgehammers and bulldozers finished, existed exclusively in whatever photographs happened to be sitting on someone's personal camera roll or a decade-old research hard drive, uploaded not for preservation but for a vacation album no one expected history to depend on. Context erased in the same years it was finally being cataloged. Within 14 months, volunteers had logged over 100,000 work sessions, matching submitted photographs to specific destroyed objects and running them through the modeling pipeline, sorting through blurry snapshots, mismatched lighting, and camera angles never intended for archival use, one frustrating match attempt at a time. 36 reconstructions were completed in total, among them the colossal Lion of Mosul, a limestone guardian figure that had stood at the Temple of Ishtar in Nimrud since roughly 860 BCE. The reconstructed lion was 3D printed and displayed in New York, alongside a Nergal relief and a statue of a Hatrine priest. Objects that existed nowhere in physical form anywhere on Earth except as a computational reconstruction built entirely from other people's holiday photographs, printed in gleaming white plastic that, up close, still showed the faint concentric rings of the 3D printing process underneath. Consider the implication. Austin Henry Layard, the 19th century excavator who first uncovered Nimrud's palaces in the 1840s, spent years transporting choice reliefs and colossal guardian figures to museums in London and Baghdad for safekeeping, assuming that institutional walls, once built, were permanent. They were not. What has since proven more durable than the museum built to protect these objects is a distributed archive of accidental images, a German tourist's 2009 snapshot, a researcher's overlooked documentation photo, a student's blurry phone picture from a school trip that no one thought of as an archive until the day it became the only one left standing. The physical Lamassu, the physical lion, the physical reliefs no longer exist. What Nimrud's guardians have become instead is a file, a 3-dimensional mesh of polygons, generated by an algorithm, sitting on a server somewhere, waiting for someone to decide whether a digital ghost of a destroyed empire counts as evidence, memorial, or something that does not yet have a name. 36 reconstructions exist for a collection that once numbered in the hundreds, meaning most of what stood in that museum and at Nimrud's palace mounds has no digital ghost at all. No tourist happened to photograph it from the right angle, at the right resolution, before the drills and the bulldozers arrived. Those pieces are not lost twice. They are lost completely, in a way an algorithm, however capable, has no photograph left to work from, and no future version of this technology will ever be able to recover. Number 2. What the blood says about who stayed. In laboratories spanning Harvard Medical School, University College Dublin, and the Israel Antiquities Authority, geneticist David Rake's team spent years extracting and sequencing DNA from petrous bones, the densest bone in the human skull, prized in ancient DNA work because its structure preserves genetic material far longer than any other skeletal element, surviving degradation that destroys DNA in almost every other part of the human body. Recovered from 5 archaeological sites across the Bronze and Iron Age southern Levant, including Tel Megiddo, Tel Shaddud, and Abel Beth Maacah, sites the Hebrew Bible itself names directly in its account of the land's conquest and settlement. In 2020, the team, led by geneticist Lily Agranat-Tamir, published genome-wide data from 73 individuals in the peer-reviewed journal Cell, under the title The Genomic History of the Bronze Age Southern Levant. For over a century, the question of who the Canaanites were, where their ancestry came from, and whether they simply vanished from the region, replaced, displaced, or annihilated in the population, upheavals the biblical conquest narratives describe, had been argued almost entirely from pottery styles, destruction layers, and inscriptions, none of which can directly answer a question about human ancestry, and all of which can be, and routinely are, read to support opposing conclusions by equally credentialed excavators standing in the same trench. The Canaanites themselves left almost no surviving first-person account of who they understood themselves to be. Their name for their own people survives mostly in the records of others, Egyptian administrative texts, the diplomatic Amarna letters, and centuries later, biblical writers describing them from the outside as the land's prior inhabitants. A population that shaped the entire textual memory of ancient Israel had until this study. No voice of its own in the historical record beyond the objects they left behind. Reich's team modeled the 73 genomes computationally against reference populations using statistical ancestry algorithms, the same broad class of population genetic modeling used to trace human migration patterns worldwide, from Neolithic Europe to the peopling of the Americas. The Bronze Age individuals, despite coming from sites scattered across the region and separated by centuries, resembled each other genetically far more than they resembled outside populations, confirming they shared a real, continuous ancestral population beneath the shared Canaanite material culture archaeologists had already identified from pottery and architecture. That ancestry traced to 2 sources, earlier local Neolithic populations and a wave of migrants related to the Chalcolithic Zagros region and the Bronze Age Caucasus. The genome data also caught something the pottery record alone could never plausibly show: 3 individual outliers within the sample set, buried among an otherwise consistent local population, whose ancestry modeled cleanly as recent migrants rather than descendants of the established Canaanite gene pool, physical, individual evidence of the population movement the broader statistical trend only implied. A separate, earlier genome study of Bronze Age skeletons from Sidon, sequenced by a different international team, had already reached a strikingly similar conclusion using Lebanese populations as the modern comparison point, estimating that the underlying admixture between local and Eastern migrant populations occurred sometime between roughly 6,600 and 3,550 years ago, a time frame that independently corroborated what Reich's larger southern Levant sample would later confirm. Using entirely separate skeletal material, a separate laboratory, and a separate modern reference population on the other side of a modern national border. Then, the model was run forward. The team compared the ancient Canaanite genomes against present-day Levantine populations, modern Jewish and Arabic-speaking communities living in the same geographic footprint today. Separated from the Bronze Age sample only by roughly 3,000 years and an unbroken chain of births no written record ever tracked. The computational result was unambiguous. Modern Levantine populations derive substantial ancestry directly from this Bronze Age Canaanite population, not replacement, not erasure whatsoever. Continuity. Run forward more than 3,000 years, confirmed by the same statistical genome modeling techniques used to trace any other ancient migration on Earth. The identical mathematics that has traced the Anglo-Saxon migration into Britain and the Bantu expansion across sub-Saharan Africa, applied here to a population whose descendants are still walking the same hills their Bronze Age. Ancestors farmed. But here's where the finding complicates the very narrative it appears to confirm. The biblical conquest account in the book of Joshua describes a population under devastating military pressure, cities destroyed, inhabitants driven out or eliminated. A genetic record showing strong, continuous Canaanite ancestry surviving into the present day does not straightforwardly match a narrative of total conquest and displacement. It matches something closer to what the archaeological destruction layer record has separately suggested for decades: a Bronze Age collapse that was real, violent, and geographically uneven, but not a wholesale replacement of one population by another. The genome data does not settle whether the biblical conquest narrative describes literal military history, later theological memory, or some combination the text itself does not fully distinguish. What it does confirm is that the people who lived in Canaanite cities did not disappear. Their descendants are, by the mathematics of population genetics, still there. The blood samples that produced this answer came from petrous bones excavated decades ago, sitting for years in storage boxes before any lab could extract what they contained. The genome sequences now exist as data files on servers at 3 institutions on 2 continents. The people they describe left no name, no inscription, no burial marker identifying them as Canaanite in their own words. Every claim of total conquest, total displacement, or total cultural erasure that has been read into the biblical narrative for 2,000 years now has to answer to 73 ancient genomes and a population modeling algorithm that does not care in the slightest which reading is more theologically comfortable. Somewhere in the region today, someone carries that ancestry in their blood without knowing it, has never been told, and never will be. Number 1. The model that found 2 hands inside one story. In a shared office spanning a mathematics department at Duke University and a computer science lab at Reichman University in Israel, a team of 6 researchers spent more than 2 years trying to break their own results. Mathematician Shira Feigenbaum-Golovin recalled the process bluntly. They spent enormous stretches of time trying to prove their own findings were garbage before they would trust them enough to publish. The team: Feigenbaum-Golovin, computer scientist Alon Kipnis, theologian Axel Blair, physicist Eli Piasecki, biblical scholar Thomas Armour, and archaeologist Israel Finkelstein, had built a statistical model to answer a question textual critics have argued over for more than 2 centuries without resolution: who truly wrote the first 9 books of the Hebrew Bible. The documentary hypothesis, most famously systematized by the German scholar Julius Wellhausen in 1878, proposed that the Torah and the historical books that follow it were woven together from multiple original sources: a priestly tradition concerned with ritual law, a Deuteronomistic tradition tied to the book of Deuteronomy, and the sweeping Deuteronomistic history that runs from Joshua through Kings. For nearly a century and a half, the theory had never been tested against anything more objective than trained scholarly instinct for style, theme, and theological emphasis, brilliant instinct honed over generations of close reading, but instinct all the same. Vulnerable to the same disagreements that have split biblical scholars into competing schools ever since Wellhausen first proposed it. Feigenbaum-Golovin's team built something closer to a courtroom standard than a literary argument. Their statistical engine used a technique called higher criticism thresholding, a method originally developed for detecting faint, rare signals buried in noisy data. The kind of statistics used to find a handful of meaningful genetic markers scattered across a genome of billions of base pairs. Applied to text, the same math becomes sensitive to exactly the kind of subtle, rare authorial habit a human reader would never consciously notice across hundreds of pages, but which a scribe reproduces unconsciously and consistently across everything he writes. Their model measured word frequency, not meaning, not theme, but the statistical rate at which each writer used ordinary, unconscious words, which, King trained on biblical chapters where scholarly consensus on authorship already existed. The model learned to distinguish the 3 traditions with enough precision that when tested against chapters of known authorship it had never seen, it correctly sorted them back into their source group. Then the team pointed the model at a passage no one had ever definitively assigned: the Ark narrative, the account spanning 1st and 2nd Samuel that describes the Philistines' capture of the Ark of the Covenant, the plagues that struck the towns that held it, and its eventual return. The story reads, on its surface, as one continuous narrative. Scholars had debated its authorship for generations without resolution. The model split it in two. The 1 Samuel portion of the Ark narrative, the capture, the plagues, the Philistine cities, matched none of the three known scribal traditions. Not priestly, not Deuteronomistic, not the Deuteronomistic history. Its statistical fingerprint stood apart from every other authorship group the model had been trained to recognize, an orphan style with no established home in the biblical corpus. The 2 Samuel portion of the same continuous story, the Ark's arrival in Jerusalem, David's procession before it, showed a clear, confident statistical match to the Deuteronomistic history. The same tradition responsible for the framing of Joshua, Judges, and Kings. One narrative, two hands. A seam running directly through the middle of a story generations of readers had experienced as a single, unbroken account, invisible to the eye and audible only to a model trained to hear word frequency patterns no human reader tracks consciously while reading. But here's where the model's credibility was truly earned, before it was ever pointed at the Ark narrative at all. Run first against chapters where the documentary hypothesis's century-old consensus was already firm. The model confirmed what generations of scholars had proposed from instinct alone, that the writing style of Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic history sat closer to each other. Statistically, than either sat to the priestly material, a result that could easily have come back scrambled, contradicting the consensus entirely, and would have quietly discredited the whole method before it ever reached a single disputed passage. It didn't. The model agreed with 2 centuries of trained human judgment on the settled cases, and only then was it trusted with the unsettled one. What makes this particular finding different from every other biblical authorship debate of the last 2 centuries is that it did not originate from a scholar's argument about theology, style, or theme that another scholar could simply disagree with on the same grounds. It originated from a statistical measurement, tested against known material before it was ever pointed at the disputed text, and validated using the same hypothesis testing standards used across experimental science generally. The model does not have a theological position. It does not know which conclusion would be more convenient for which tradition, or which finding will unsettle a reader who has never once considered that the books on their shelf might not be as seamless as the binding suggests. It measured word frequency and returned an answer that happened to split a beloved, continuous story into 2 separate literary sources, one of which matches no known biblical author at all, a style with no home anywhere else in the entire Hebrew Bible. The Ark narrative is still printed today as one uninterrupted story in every translation on every shelf, exactly as it has been for 2,000 years. The seam the model found runs invisibly through the text millions of people read this year without ever knowing it was there. Somewhere in the space between 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, 2 different scribal hands, working in 2 different traditions, in 2 different eras of Israel's history, wrote half a story each. And for the first time since either of them set down a stylus, something has finally noticed the difference. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.